Picture this, the year is 67 AD, and the streets of ancient Rome are alive with the clamor of merchants, the scent of olive oil and burning incense hanging heavy in the air. You push your way through the crowded forum only to stumble upon a scene that stops your heart cold. There, under the glaring Mediterranean sun, walks Emperor Nero, the most powerful man on earth, his hand resting tenderly upon the arm of his new bride. Draped in silks adorned with jewels, the figure moves with delicate grace, but something is wrong. Whispers ripple through the crowd like a poisoned breeze, and your stomach twists with a sickening realization. This is no woman. This is a boy. His name was Sporus. And what would happen to him in the months that followed stands among the most grotesque acts ever recorded in imperial history. This is not a love story. It is a chronicle of obsession, of a ruler whose grief curdled into madness, and whose power turned a human being into an object, a doll, a ghost wearing someone else's face. In every empire, there are stories like this, tales buried beneath marble monuments and gilded palaces, the kind of stories history books prefer to whisper if they tell them at all. We like to imagine that the past was grand and glorious, that emperors were titans of vision and conquest. But behind the golden facades often lurk shadows long and cold, where the value of a life could be rewritten with a single command, where love could be twisted into something unrecognizable, and where the boundary between devotion and destruction vanished like smoke in the Roman summer. Before we dive into the heart of this tale, ask yourself, what is a person without their name, their body, their will? What remains of the soul when every piece of their identity is stripped away and worn like a mask by someone else's desire? The story of Sporus is not just a chapter of Nero's madness. It is a mirror held up to absolute power itself. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In the wrong hands, grief can become tyranny, and love can become the sharpest weapon of all. Nero was not born a monster. When he ascended the throne at the tender age of 16, Rome dared to dream of a golden dawn. Taxes were reduced, public games flourished, theaters echoed with laughter, and for a fleeting moment the empire believed it had found a ruler who would blend art with justice and power with mercy. But absolute power is a poison. It seeps not in sudden waves, but in slow, invisible currents, until the man who once walked among his people becomes something else entirely. By the year 65 AD, Nero was no longer the hopeful youth Rome once adored. The cheers of the masses had turned into watchful silence. The Senate had become a chamber of veiled threats. He slept beneath a ceiling of painted stars, but his nights were haunted by whispers, conspiracies, betrayals, shadows that moved where no shadows should be. And then, into this gathering storm stepped a woman who would set the course of his undoing, Poppaea Sabina. She was everything the imperial court worshipped, radiant, intelligent, ambitious enough to share the emperor's hunger for immortality. Where his first wife, Octavia, was dutiful and quiet, Poppaea was a blaze of color, commanding every gaze that dared linger. To Nero, she was not merely a lover, she was a vision. And visions, when clutched too tightly, can cut like shards of glass. Hook, what happens when an emperor, used to shaping laws and lives with a gesture, decides that love must obey him too? What began as a scandalous affair soon metastasized into obsession. Nero did not simply wish to possess Poppaea, he sought to reshape the world around her, to silence rivals, to strip away anyone who stood between them. Guards shadowed her steps. Courtiers were dismissed or exiled at a word. Gold drained from the treasury, flowing into silks, gems, and perfumes meant to preserve her smile a little longer. Yet, even as he wrapped her in luxury, a seed of destruction took root. Love had become ownership, devotion had curdled into surveillance. And in the dim corridors of the Palatine Palace, Poppaea must have felt the chill of that truth. A cage made of gold is still a cage. It was in this feverish crucible of adoration, jealousy, and a loneliness only the powerful truly know that the tragedy of Sporus began to form. Still unseen, like a storm building far beyond the horizon. By the summer of 65 AD, the air in the imperial palace had grown thick, not just with incense and wine, but with tension. Poppaea Sabina, once the star of Nero's universe, was now the fragile axis upon which his paranoia spun. Her beauty, her charm, even her pregnancy, none of it shielded her from the storms that brewed inside the emperor's mind. They say power isolates, but grief, when it festers, makes a man dangerous. Nero had begun to see betrayal in glances, rebellion in whispers, and even the smallest resistance as an insult to his will. Poppaea, pregnant with what could have been the heir of Rome, tried to soothe his rages, but in a house where every wall had ears and every servant feared his shadow, comfort was just another word for risk. Then came that night. Historians write it simply: a quarrel, a blow, a life ended. But what does that mean really? It means a scream in the dark. A crash of silver on marble, a young woman collapsing to the cold floor, hands clutching a womb that would never bear its child. It means an emperor drunk on wine and suspicion, standing over the very thing he swore he could not live without. Hook, what kind of love leaves a corpse where a promise should have been? The morning after, the palace was silent. Rome never saw her funeral pyre. Nero refused to burn her body in the customary rites. Fire was too final, too honest. Instead, he embalmed her, preserved her, adorned her like a goddess, as if death were a temporary inconvenience rather than a door slammed shut. And yet the emptiness howled. Poppaea's rooms were sealed but never dark. Her scent lingered in the halls, her name on his lips in drunken murmurs. Witnesses claimed he would speak to her as if she still lived, asking advice, whispering apologies, or perhaps commands. In those gilded chambers, grief metastasized into something colder, sharper, a need to undo the irreparable, to summon the dead back to life in the only way a tyrant knows, by force. This was the moment the line between love and madness vanished. And somewhere in the streets of Rome, a boy named Sporus still breathed, unaware that fate was already sketching his outline upon the emperor's haunted heart. In the months after Poppaea's death, Nero's palace turned into a shrine of absence. Her dresses remained draped on golden stands, her rings untouched in carved ivory boxes, her laughter replaced by the echo of empty halls. But what does an emperor do when his power cannot command the dead to return? He creates a replacement. Somewhere among the servants and freedmen of the imperial household was a boy, barely 14 or 15, named Sporus. No one knows if it was the tilt of his chin, the softness of his eyes, or the cruel coincidence of youth that sealed his fate. What we do know is this: Nero saw in him the ghost of his lost wife, and ghosts are dangerous things when you try to make them flesh. Hook, imagine being noticed by the most powerful man alive and realizing that his gaze was not a gift but a sentence. The decision came swiftly, as so many of Nero's decisions did. Sporus would become Poppaea. Not in spirit, not in memory, in body. They say the emperor ordered him prepared, his body altered, his voice preserved, his very being reshaped. There are no gentle words for what was done, a crude, irreversible operation, stripping him of the future he might have had, sealing his fate in a single brutal act. From that day forward, Sporus was taught to walk with grace, to lower his gaze just so, to wear the silks that still carried the scent of the woman whose name he would inherit. His lips were painted, his hair curled and perfumed. Courtiers whispered, some in disgust, others in fear, as the boy was paraded like a relic reborn, a living shrine to an obsession gone rotten. And what of Sporus himself? History does not record his screams. It does not capture the nights he stared at the polished bronze mirror, trying to remember the boy he used to be before that name was stolen from him. It tells us only that he complied, because what choice does a lamb have in the presence of a starving wolf? In that moment, the empire learned a chilling lesson. In Rome, even grief could be sculpted, perfumed, and made to dance for the crowd. The wedding took place under a sky the color of tarnished bronze, as if the gods themselves had turned their faces away. Rome gathered in uneasy splendor. Senators in crimson-trimmed togas, soldiers with eyes fixed on the marble floor, slaves scattering petals that smelled faintly of decay. In the center of it all stood Nero, draped in imperial purple, a laurel crown pressed too tightly against his brow. Beside him, trembling beneath layers of silk that did not belong to him, was Sporus. His hands were pale and cold, fingers slick with the sweat of terror. Witnesses whispered that his lips moved without sound, like a man praying to gods who had already abandoned him. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the empire watched as its emperor married a boy made to resemble the woman he had destroyed. Hook, was this a union or a haunting performed in daylight? The feast that followed was a grotesque theater. Musicians played the same melodies once favored by Poppaea. Wine flowed like blood down the steps of the banquet hall. Courtiers laughed too loudly, too quickly, their faces rigid masks, because in Nero's Rome, a laugh given too late was as dangerous as an open insult. Sporus sat at the emperor's side, each toast a blade against his throat, each glance from the crowd a silent accusation. You are her shadow, nothing more. The gold bracelet on his wrist felt heavier than iron shackles. The perfume in his hair choked him with the memory of someone else's life. Nights were worse. The palace corridors glowed with lamplight that flickered like dying stars. Nero would summon him to chambers still scented with the dead, would speak to him in whispers meant for another, would trace the line of his jaw as if trying to redraw a face already lost to the grave. There were no screams here, only the soft rustle of silk over stone, the muffled sound of a soul eroding one breath at a time. And outside, Rome continued to burn its offerings, drink its wine, cheer its games, because what is one life against the machinery of an empire? This was not love. This was a performance staged for a heart that could not grieve honestly. And for Sporus, it was the beginning of a life lived entirely in someone else's shadow, where every dawn felt like a continuation of someone else's death. Years passed, but the palace did not forget. Its corridors still breathed with the faint perfume of a woman long gone, and its marble steps still carried the echo of a boy forced to play her ghost. Nero aged, but he did not soften. His nights grew longer, his days more frantic, his pleasures more desperate, as if each feast, each spectacle, each cruel whim might drown the voice that whispered in his skull, "You killed her, and yet she never leaves." He dragged Sporus everywhere, to the theater, to the games, even to the Senate, dressed not as a man but as the echo of a woman buried in an unmarked grave. Courtiers bowed, gladiators saluted, and Rome pretended this was normal, because in an empire built on fear, silence was safer than truth. But what happens when an emperor starts seeing ghosts in every shadow except the one he created himself? By the winter of 67 AD, the signs of unraveling were impossible to ignore. Nero stopped trusting his generals. Messengers vanished between campaigns. Senators whispered behind closed doors, then stopped whispering at all. Fires broke out, some say by accident, others say by command, painting the city in the same flames that once devoured its slums. And still he clung to Sporus. Witnesses claimed Nero would dress him in Poppaea's gowns during festivals, make him sing in her voice at midnight gatherings, even force him to sit beside him on judgment days, as if the dead could help him decide the fate of the living. There were moments, they say, when the emperor would pause mid-sentence, eyes glazed, lips moving without words, like a man listening to something only he could hear. Sporus would stand there, silent, every breath a calculation. To speak might trigger rage, to remain still might trigger madness. The empire, once a roaring lion, was now a beast gnawing its own bones. Armies in the provinces began to break their oaths. Governors stopped sending tribute, and somewhere, far from the marble halls, men were already forging the daggers that would end his reign. For Sporus, there was no escape, only the endless performance, the cold weight of stolen identity, the growing certainty that he would not outlive the shadow he was forced to cast. And for Rome, it was learning a lesson carved in fear, that an empire ruled by a ghost will one day become one. The year was 68 AD when the empire finally turned on its mad conductor. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. His guards deserted him one by one, like shadows peeling away from a dying flame. In the final hours, the man who once commanded armies, set cities alight, and bent lives to his will fled through the gardens of his own palace, no longer an emperor, just a fugitive haunted by the ghosts he had created. Sporus followed. Not by choice, by gravity. Where else could he go? He had become the emperor's reflection, and when the mirror cracks, the reflection shatters with it. But what happens to a ghost when the one who summoned it is gone? Nero's last moments were not heroic. Cornered, abandoned, his trembling hands held a dagger he could not bring himself to use. In the end, it was a freedman who helped guide the blade. As the blood spread across the floor, Nero whispered, "What an artist dies in me." An artist, perhaps, but what of the lives he painted over? After Nero's death, Rome did not free Sporus. It passed him like a cursed heirloom from one powerful man to another, first Otho, then Vitellius. They dressed him, displayed him, used him as a symbol, a trophy, a shadow with a pulse. Until one day Vitellius, cruel in a way even Nero had not dared, announced he would force Sporus to play the role of a maiden in a grotesque public spectacle, only this time. The ending would be death. Faced with that final humiliation, Sporus chose his own ending. Some say he took his life quietly, a final act of rebellion in a life where choice had been stolen. Others say he simply disappeared into history's mist, his name surviving only because it clung to the corpse of an empire's obsession. And so the story closes, an emperor who could not let go of the dead and a boy who was never allowed to truly live. In every shadow of history, there is a voice like Sporus's, unwritten, unheard, erased by the men who believed their grief was worth more than another's life. If this story unsettled you, good. History is not always marble statues and glorious conquests. It is also whispers in the dark, names lost to cruelty, choices made in rooms that smelled of wine and fear. And if you want to keep uncovering these buried truths, the dark corners of history that were never meant to be seen, then stay with us. Subscribe. Follow Keep the Light On, because there are more shadows waiting.